The millionaire CEO laughed. "If she plays piano, I'll marry her." But when the 22-year-old waitress touched the keys, the entire restaurant froze in disbelief. Follow our channel and hit the like button to support these emotional stories. Your engagement helps us bring more touching moments to life. Now let's dive in. The crystal chandeliers of Le Bernardin cast golden shadows across the marble floors as Alexander Sterling adjusted his Armani suit and surveyed the elegant dining room with the practiced eye of someone who owned half of Manhattan's most exclusive establishments. At 34, he commanded boardrooms with the same ruthless precision he used to dissect a perfectly prepared Dover sole. His dark hair was styled to perfection, his steel-grey eyes calculating every detail of the room, from the imported Italian tablecloths to the worth of each patron's jewelry. "Another champagne, Mr. Sterling?" The sommelier approached with reverent deference, recognizing one of New York's most formidable business titans. Alexander nodded curtly, his attention already shifting to the quarterly reports displayed on his phone screen. Sterling Industries had just closed a $3 billion merger, yet here he sat, obligated to attend his business partner's anniversary dinner when he could be strategizing their next acquisition. "Alexander, you're being antisocial again," chided Victoria Ashworth, sliding into the chair beside him. Her red Valentino dress probably cost more than most people's cars, and her smile held the calculated warmth of someone who'd been raised in Manhattan's social elite. "This is supposed to be a celebration." "I celebrate by making money, Victoria. This," he gestured around the opulent restaurant, "is a waste of time that could be better spent preparing for the Hartwell acquisition." Victoria laughed, a sound like expensive wind chimes. "You know what your problem is. You've forgotten how to have fun. When was the last time you did something spontaneous?" Before Alexander could respond with his usual cutting remark about spontaneity being the enemy of success, a young woman appeared at their table. She moved with quiet grace despite carrying a heavily loaded tray, her long auburn hair pulled back in a simple ponytail that somehow made her green eyes more striking. The black uniform of the restaurant's waitstaff couldn't disguise her natural elegance, though Alexander barely glanced up from his phone. "Good evening. I'm Emma, and I'll be taking care of your table tonight," she said, her voice carrying a slight rasp that suggested exhaustion. "Can I start you with any appetizers?" Victoria ordered, with the casual extravagance of someone who'd never checked a price, while Alexander continued scrolling through emails. When Emma turned to him expectantly, he finally looked up, and for a moment something flickered in his expression, a recognition of intelligence in her eyes that seemed out of place for a waitress in even the finest establishment. "The usual," he said dismissively, returning to his phone. "I'm sorry, sir, but I don't know what your usual order is. This is my first evening serving your section." The slight sharpness in her tone made Alexander look up again, this time with the focused attention he usually reserved for boardroom adversaries. There was something in the way she held herself, a dignity that refused to be diminished by his condescension. "Oysters Rockefeller, the Wagyu beef, medium rare and whatever wine pairs best," he said, his voice carrying the impatience of someone unaccustomed to repeating himself. "Excellent choice." "The 2015 Bordeaux would complement the Wagyu beautifully," Emma replied, and Alexander caught the subtle note of knowledge in her recommendation, knowledge that went beyond standard server training. As she walked away, Victoria leaned closer. "She's pretty." "She's the help," Alexander replied, though his eyes followed Emma's retreating figure longer than he cared to admit. The evening progressed with typical Manhattan social theater, discussions of real estate prices, complaints about the mayor's policies, and gossip about which socialite was divorcing which hedge fund prince. Alexander participated with half his attention, while the other half remained fixed on quarterly projections, until Victoria suddenly grabbed his arm. "Oh my God, Alexander, look!" She pointed toward the restaurant's grand piano, where the evening's scheduled pianist, a distinguished older gentleman, was being helped to a chair by concerned staff members. "Ladies and gentlemen," announced the maitre d', his French accent thick with concern, "I'm afraid Monsieur Dubois has taken ill and will be unable to perform this evening. We sincerely apologize for any disappointment." A murmur of disappointment rippled through the dining room. The piano was a centerpiece of Le Bernardin's ambiance, its nightly performances as essential as the expertly prepared cuisine. Alexander saw an opportunity for entertainment in the disruption. The champagne had loosened his tongue, and Victoria's earlier comment about spontaneity had touched a nerve. He stood commanding attention with the natural authority that came from owning buildings taller than most people's ambitions. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice carried easily across the restaurant, "I have a proposition that might salvage our evening's entertainment." All eyes turned to him, including Emma's, who had been clearing a nearby table. Alexander's gaze found hers and held it, a predatory smile spreading across his handsome features. "I'll bet anyone in this room that our charming waitress here," he gestured toward Emma, who had gone completely still, "can't play a single piece on that piano with any degree of competence. In fact, I'm so confident in this assessment that I'll make an outrageous wager." The restaurant had fallen completely silent, the kind of silence that precedes either triumph or disaster. Emma's face had gone pale, but her green eyes blazed with something that might have been fury or determination. "What kind of wager, Mr. Sterling?" The use of his name surprised him. She'd been listening, learning, cataloguing information like any good intelligence gatherer. "Interesting. If you can play any classical piece with the skill of a trained musician, really play, not just stumble through chopsticks, I'll marry you." The words came out before his rational mind could stop them, fueled by champagne and the absolute certainty that a waitress couldn't possibly possess such skills. Victoria gasped. "Alexander, you can't be serious." "Dead serious," he replied, his eyes never leaving Emma's face. "Of course, when you inevitably fail, you'll quit this job tonight and never work in any establishment I frequent again. Fair enough?" The cruelty of the wager wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Alexander Sterling could destroy a service worker's career in Manhattan with a single phone call, and everyone knew it. This wasn't just a bet. It was a public humiliation designed to amuse a bored billionaire. Emma stood perfectly still for a long moment, her hands trembling slightly at her sides. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a quiet strength that made Alexander's smug confidence waver almost imperceptibly. "And if I win, you'll honor your word? You'll actually marry me?" "I'm a man of my word in business," Alexander replied, though something in Emma's tone made him suddenly wish he'd ordered another bottle of wine instead of making foolish bets. Emma walked toward the piano with measured steps, her posture straightening with each stride. As she passed tables of Manhattan's elite, whispers followed in her wake. Some diners had their phones out, recording what they assumed would be either spectacular failure or social media gold. She sat at the bench, her fingers hovering over the keys for a moment that stretched into eternity. When she finally placed her hands on the keyboard, something extraordinary happened. The opening notes of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 filled the restaurant with crystalline perfection. Not the simple melody, but the full, complex arrangement that required years of classical training to master. Emma's fingers moved across the keys with fluid precision, her entire body swaying with the music, as if she and the piano were old lovers reunited after a long separation. The technical difficulty of the piece was staggering: rapid scales, complex harmonies, and emotional passages that required not just skill but deep musical understanding. Emma played it flawlessly, her face transformed by concentration and something deeper, something that looked like pain being channeled into beauty. Alexander's smug smile had vanished completely. His champagne glass hung forgotten in his hand as he watched this waitress, this woman he'd dismissed as the help, perform with the skill of a conservatory graduate. Around the restaurant, conversations had stopped entirely. Even the kitchen staff had emerged to listen. When Emma reached the concerto's most technically challenging passage, a section that separated amateur pianists from true artists, she didn't just survive it, she soared. Her left hand maintained the complex bass line, while her right hand danced through intricate melodies with a precision that would have impressed Carnegie Hall audiences. The final notes lingered in the air like a blessing, and for several heartbeats no one moved. Then applause erupted, genuine and thunderous, from every corner of the restaurant. Several women were crying, and even the hardened maitre d' was wiping his eyes. Emma stood slowly, her hands shaking now from more than just nerves. She looked directly at Alexander, and in her eyes he saw something that made his chest tight. Not triumph, but a profound sadness, mixed with steely determination. "I believe you owe me a wedding, Mr. Sterling." Alexander Sterling had built his empire by never showing weakness. But as he stared at Emma across the now silent restaurant, he felt something he hadn't experienced since childhood. Complete uncertainty. The woman standing by the piano wasn't the simple waitress he'd mockingly challenged. The skill she'd just demonstrated represented years of elite musical training, the kind that cost more than most people's annual salaries. "That was," Victoria whispered beside him, but her words trailed off as she processed the implications of what they'd all witnessed. Alexander's business instincts kicked in, searching for an escape clause, a technicality that could void his impulsive wager. But he'd made the bet publicly, in front of Manhattan's social elite, many of whom were already recording the aftermath on their phones. His reputation for being a man of his word in business deals was the foundation of his success. He couldn't simply walk away from this without destroying his credibility. Emma began walking back toward their table, her movements controlled but graceful. As she approached, Alexander noticed details he'd missed before. The way she carried herself with natural poise despite wearing a server's uniform, the intelligence in her green eyes that suggested depths he hadn't bothered to explore, and something else, a wariness that spoke of experience with disappointment. "Well," she said quietly when she reached his table, "are you a man of your word, or just another rich man who thinks promises are for other people?" The challenge in her voice sparked something competitive in Alexander's nature. He stood, matching her height in her comfortable flats to his expensive Italian shoes. "I made a public wager, and you fulfilled your end admirably. But surely you don't expect me to actually marry someone I've known for all of 30 minutes. I expect you to honor your commitment, Mr. Sterling. You made the terms quite clear. If I could play classical music with the skill of a trained musician, you'd marry me." I held up my end of the bargain, Victoria gasped. "Emma, you can't be serious. You don't actually want to marry him." Emma's smile held no warmth. "Oh, but I am serious. Deadly serious." Alexander studied her face, looking for signs of gold-digger desperation or social climbing ambition. Instead, he found something far more complex, determination mixed with what looked suspiciously like hurt pride and carefully controlled anger. "You're calling in the debt?" he asked, his voice dropping to the low tone he used in hostile business negotiations. "I'm collecting on a promise. There's a difference." The surrounding diners were still watching, phones still recording, social media posts already being crafted about the most outrageous bet in Manhattan's social history. Alexander realized he was trapped by his own arrogance and the very public nature of his foolish wager. "Fine," he said, his jaw tight, "but we'll do this properly. A real engagement, a proper wedding. If I'm going to honor this ridiculous bet, we'll do it right." Emma's composure flickered for just a moment, as if she hadn't expected him to actually agree. "How properly?" 6 months engagement minimum. You'll move into my penthouse. We'll attend social functions together. And you'll learn what it means to be married to someone in my position. If after 6 months you still want to go through with this insanity, we'll have a wedding that won't embarrass either of us. And if I change my mind during those 6 months, Alexander's smile was sharp, then you walk away with nothing, having proven that this was just an elaborate gold-digger scheme. The insult hit its mark. Emma's cheeks flushed with anger. "I'm not a gold-digger, Mr. Sterling. I'm a woman who believes people should keep their promises." "We'll see," he replied coolly. Then louder for the benefit of their audience, "Ladies and gentlemen, it appears I'm engaged." The restaurant erupted in surprised chatter and congratulations that ranged from genuine to clearly fake. Victoria looked stunned, while Emma appeared to be questioning her own sanity. As the evening wound down and other diners began to leave, many stopping to congratulate the unlikely couple, Alexander found himself alone with Emma by the piano. The restaurant staff was giving them space, though he caught them whispering and stealing glances. "So," he said, adjusting his cufflinks in a gesture that betrayed his nervousness, "I suppose we should discuss practical arrangements. Do you have somewhere to live currently?" "A small apartment in Queens," Emma replied, her voice careful and neutral. "You'll need to give notice immediately." I'll have my assistant arrange for your belongings to be moved to my penthouse. We'll need to shop for appropriate clothing. My fiancé can't be seen in." He gestured vaguely at her server's uniform. Emma's eyes flashed dangerously. "There's nothing wrong with honest work, Mr. Sterling. And there's nothing wrong with my clothes outside of this uniform." "Of course not," he said quickly, recognizing he'd stumbled into dangerous territory. "I simply meant that as my fiancé, you'll be attending events that have certain expectations about attire. Designer gowns and jewelry worth more than some people's houses?" "Exactly." Emma was quiet for a long moment, studying his face. "Can I ask you something?" "What? Why did you make that bet? Really? Was it just cruelty for entertainment, or was there something else?" The question caught Alexander off guard with its directness. He found himself actually considering it seriously, instead of deflecting with his usual sarcasm. "Honestly, you intrigued me," he admitted. "There was something about the way you carried yourself, the way you recommended that wine. You didn't seem like just a waitress, but I couldn't figure out what you were hiding. The bet was crude curiosity, I suppose." "And what do you think now that you know I can play piano?" Alexander looked at her carefully. "Now I think you're hiding much more than I initially suspected. The question is whether that makes you more interesting or more dangerous." Emma's laugh held no humor. "I suppose you'll find out during our 6-month engagement, won't you?" "I suppose I will." He paused, then asked, "Where did you learn to play like that?" That wasn't amateur hour talent. For the first time since the bet began, Emma's composure cracked slightly. Pain flashed across her features before she controlled it. "That's a story for another day, Mr. Sterling." "Alexander," he corrected automatically. "If we're going to be engaged, you should use my first name." "Alexander," she repeated, and something about the way she said it made his name sound different, more personal. "And you should know I'm not doing this for your money. I have my own reasons for accepting this arrangement." "What reasons?" Emma gathered her purse and the light jacket she'd worn to work. "Like I said, that's a story for another day. But Alexander, you might want to have your assistant research the name Emma Blackwood before I move into your penthouse." She walked away, leaving Alexander standing by the piano with the distinct feeling that he'd just agreed to far more than a simple business arrangement. The name Blackwood tickled something in his memory, but he couldn't quite place it. As he watched Emma disappear into the Manhattan night, Alexander Sterling, who had never met a challenge he couldn't conquer or a problem he couldn't solve with money, realized he might have finally bitten off more than he could chew, and for the first time in years he found himself genuinely curious about what tomorrow would bring. Alexander's penthouse occupied the entire top floor of Sterling Tower, a testament to both his success and his need to remain above the city he'd conquered. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of Manhattan, while the interior design spoke of refined taste and unlimited budgets. As he waited for Emma to arrive with her belongings, he found himself unusually restless. His assistant, Margaret Chen, had delivered the research he'd requested on Emma Blackwood with her typical efficiency, but the file she'd placed on his mahogany desk remained unopened. Some instinct told him he should hear Emma's story from her own lips, rather than read it in a cold investigative report. The elevator chimed, and Emma stepped into his private foyer, carrying 2 modest suitcases and a worn leather messenger bag. She'd traded her server's uniform for dark jeans and a cream silk blouse that suggested she owned better clothes than he'd assumed. Her auburn hair fell loose around her shoulders, and without the harsh restaurant lighting, he could see that she was even more beautiful than he'd initially realized. "Impressive," she said, looking around the space with an appraising eye that suggested familiarity with luxury, rather than awe at experiencing it for the first time. "You don't seem surprised by the accommodations," Alexander observed. "I'm not," Emma replied simply, setting down her luggage. "I've seen places like this before." Another puzzle piece that didn't quite fit the waitress narrative. Alexander filed the information away and gestured toward the hallway. "The guest suite is down the hall. You'll have your own bathroom, walk-in closet and sitting area, complete privacy." Emma nodded. "And what exactly do you expect from me during these 6 months?" "Public appearances as my fiancé. Social events, business dinners, charity galas. You'll need to be convincing in the role. My reputation depends on this looking legitimate. And privately? Alexander met her gaze directly. Privately, we're strangers who made a foolish bet. I won't pretend this is some romantic fairy tale, and I assume you're too intelligent to expect one. Emma's smile was enigmatic. You assume a great deal about what I expect, Alexander. She moved to the window, looking out over the city with an expression he couldn't read. In profile, with the afternoon light catching her features, she looked almost aristocratic, the kind of bone structure that suggested generations of breeding and privilege. "Can I ask you something?" she said without turning around. "What? Do you remember the Blackwood Industries collapse 8 years ago?" The name hit Alexander like a physical blow. Suddenly he knew exactly why Blackwood had seemed familiar. The scandal had been front-page news for months, a family empire built over 4 generations, destroyed overnight by embezzlement charges and fraudulent accounting. The family had lost everything. Their fortune, their social standing, their reputation. "You're not," he began, but Emma turned to face him, and her expression confirmed his suspicion. Emma Blackwood, former heiress to a $2 billion fortune, former member of New York's social elite, former student at Juilliard, where I was studying piano performance before my world imploded. Her voice was steady, but he could hear the pain underneath. Current waitress, former cleaning lady, former nanny, former whatever job I could get to survive. Alexander stared at her, pieces of the puzzle finally clicking into place. "Your father was Jonathan Blackwood, the embezzlement scandal." "My father was framed," Emma said quietly, "by his business partner and best friend, who needed a scapegoat when their offshore accounts were discovered by federal investigators. But by the time the truth came out, Dad was already dead from a heart attack brought on by the stress and humiliation. The family name was destroyed, the money was gone, and I was 22 years old with a music degree and no practical skills for survival in the real world." The raw honesty in her voice made Alexander feel something unfamiliar, shame at his earlier dismissiveness, and something deeper that might have been respect. "Why didn't you tell me this at the restaurant?" Emma laughed bitterly. "And what would you have done? Probably offered me money out of pity and rescinded your bet." "I didn't want your charity, Alexander. I wanted your pride to cost you something, the way it cost my family everything." "So this is revenge." "This is justice," Emma corrected. "You made a bet designed to humiliate someone you saw as beneath you. Instead, you're going to learn what it's like to be bound by a commitment you can't buy your way out of." Alexander walked to his bar and poured himself a scotch, his mind racing. Emma Blackwood, he remembered her now from society pages, back when she'd been a promising young pianist and a fixture at Manhattan charity events. The transformation from privileged socialite to service worker must have been devastating. "The piano skills," he said, understanding flooding through him. 12 years of training at the finest conservatories money could buy. I was scheduled to perform with the New York Philharmonic the month after my world collapsed. Instead, I spent that month learning how to clean office buildings for minimum wage. Alexander downed his scotch, the burn helping him process this revelation. "Why take the bet, Emma? You could have just let me make a fool of myself and walked away." Emma moved closer, and he could smell her perfume. Something subtle and expensive that suggested old money rather than new wealth. "Because I've spent 8 years being invisible, being dismissed, being treated as less than human by people who used to bow and scrape for my family's approval. Last night you looked at me the way they all do, as if I was nothing, and I realized I was tired of being nothing. So you decided to become my fiancé. I decided to remind a certain arrogant CEO that actions have consequences, even for men who think they're untouchable." Alexander found himself oddly impressed by her strategic thinking. "And what happens in 6 months when this engagement is supposed to end? What's your exit strategy?" Emma's smile was mysterious. "Who says I have one?" The implications of that statement hung in the air between them. Alexander studied her face, looking for signs of gold-digger opportunism, but instead found something more complex: intelligence, determination, and what might have been genuine attraction beneath the calculated strategy. "You're playing a dangerous game, Emma Blackwood. I learn from the best," she replied. 8 years in the service industry teaches you how to read people, how to anticipate their moves, how to survive in a world that wants to crush you. You may have built an empire, Alexander, but I've learned how to rise from the ashes of one. Alexander set down his empty glass, his business instincts warring with something else, and growing fascination with this woman who had turned his simple, cruel bet into something far more complex. "All right," he said finally. 6 months. But Emma, if you think you can play me the way those society vultures played your father, you're going to be disappointed. I didn't build Sterling Industries by being naive about people's motivations. Emma's laugh was genuinely amused this time. "Oh, Alexander, if you think this is about money, you really don't understand what game we're playing." As she picked up her luggage and headed toward the guest suite, Alexander found himself watching her with new eyes. Emma Blackwood wasn't just beautiful or talented or mysterious. She was dangerous in a way that had nothing to do with physical threat, and everything to do with the growing certainty that his carefully controlled life was about to become very, very complicated. And despite every rational instinct screaming warnings, he found himself looking forward to finding out exactly how complicated things were about to become. 3 weeks into their engagement, Alexander Sterling discovered that living with Emma Blackwood was like trying to contain lightning in a bottle. She moved through his penthouse with the unconscious grace of someone born to luxury, yet her sharp observations about his business dealings revealed an intelligence that constantly surprised him. What disturbed him most was how naturally she fit into his world, and how much he'd begun to look forward to their evening conversations over dinner. That illusion of harmony shattered on a cold Tuesday morning when Margaret Chen knocked on his office door with an expression that meant trouble. "Sir, there's a situation developing. Richard Hartwell is here with his legal team, and they're demanding an immediate meeting. They seem agitated." Alexander looked up from the merger documents spread across his desk. The Hartwell acquisition was the crown jewel of Sterling Industries' expansion plan, worth $4 billion and 18 months of careful negotiation. Richard Hartwell was old-money Manhattan aristocracy, the kind of man who viewed business as a gentleman's game with unwritten rules. "Send them in." Richard Hartwell entered with 2 lawyers flanking him like bodyguards. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his Savile Row suit impeccable, but his usually composed demeanor showed cracks of barely controlled fury. "Alexander," he said without preamble, "we need to discuss your recent romantic entanglement." Alexander's blood chilled. "I'm not sure what you mean, Richard. Don't insult my intelligence." Hartwell dropped a manila folder on the desk. "Emma Blackwood, the fallen heiress you're parading around as your fiancée. Did you really think I wouldn't investigate the woman who's suddenly appeared in your life just as we're finalizing the largest merger in both our companies' histories?" Alexander opened the folder with steady hands, though his pulse was racing. Inside were photographs of Emma at charity events from 8 years ago, newspaper clippings about the Blackwood family scandal, and recent paparazzi shots of her and Alexander at a gallery opening the previous week. "This is irrelevant to our business dealings," Alexander said carefully. Hartwell's laugh was cold. "Irrelevant? Alexander, I'm about to merge my family's century-old company with yours. That requires absolute trust, complete confidence in your judgment, and you've just proven that your judgment is catastrophically compromised." "How exactly have I done that?" "By allowing yourself to be seduced by a gold digger with revenge fantasies. Do you have any idea what Emma Blackwood's real agenda might be? Her father's business partner, the man who supposedly framed Jonathan Blackwood, was my cousin, David Hartwell." Alexander felt the floor drop out from under him. David Hartwell had been found dead in his Swiss chalet 2 years ago, an apparent suicide after years of guilt over the Blackwood scandal. The case had been closed with his death, all questions answered, all blame assigned. "I see you're beginning to understand," Richard continued ruthlessly. "Emma Blackwood has every reason to hate my family, and by extension anyone associated with us. What better way to destroy the Hartwell-Sterling merger than to seduce you into a compromising position?" Alexander's mind raced through every conversation he'd had with Emma, looking for signs of deception or manipulation. But all he could remember was her honesty about her past, her dignity in the face of his initial cruelty, and the growing warmth in her eyes when she looked at him. You're suggesting she orchestrated our meeting at the restaurant. I'm suggesting she's been planning revenge for 8 years, and you've walked directly into her trap. Hartwell leaned forward. Alexander, I've known you since you were a boy. Your father and I were friends for 40 years. Don't let a beautiful woman with a sob story destroy everything you've built. The door to Alexander's office opened, and Emma appeared, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the kind of casual elegance that made his chest tight every morning. She stopped when she saw the gathering, her eyes quickly assessing the tension in the room. I'm sorry, I didn't realize you were in a meeting, she said, but her gaze had already found the photographs scattered across Alexander's desk. Richard Hartwell stood, his voice dripping with false courtesy. Miss Blackwood, how lovely to finally meet you properly. Though I believe we've met before, at several charity events back when your family was still relevant. Emma's composure didn't crack, but Alexander saw her hands tighten on the coffee cups. Mr. Hartwell, I remember you from those events. You always spoke so fondly of your cousin David. The name hung in the air like poison. Alexander watched Emma's face, looking for any sign that Hartwell's accusations might be true, but her expression remained carefully neutral. David was troubled by what happened to your family, Hartwell said. The guilt ate at him until it killed him. Guilt is a powerful emotion, Emma agreed quietly. It can drive people to desperate actions. Alexander couldn't read the undercurrents flowing between them, but the temperature in the room had dropped 10 degrees. Something was happening here that went far deeper than business concerns or romantic skepticism. Emma, Alexander said slowly, perhaps you could give us some privacy to finish our meeting. She looked at him for a long moment, and he saw something die in her eyes, a trust or hope that had been growing between them over the past 3 weeks. Of course, she said. I understand completely. After she left, Hartwell turned back to Alexander with grim satisfaction. You see how she manipulates situations, how she positions herself as the victim while inserting herself into private business discussions. She brought me coffee, Richard. That's hardly industrial espionage. It's surveillance, Alexander. She's gathering intelligence on our merger, probably planning to sabotage it at the worst possible moment. Hartwell gathered the photographs. I'm giving you a choice. End this engagement immediately, publicly and definitively, or the Hartwell-Sterling merger is dead. I won't risk 4 generations of my family's legacy on your romantic delusions. Alexander stared at the older man, feeling the walls of his carefully constructed world closing in. The merger wasn't just business. It was his legacy, his proof that he'd surpassed even his father's achievements. Without it, Sterling Industries would remain successful, but never legendary. How long do I have to decide? 24 hours. But Alexander, if you choose her over this deal, you'll be making the biggest mistake of your life. And unlike romantic disappointments, business mistakes like this don't heal with time. After Hartwell left, Alexander sat alone in his office, staring at the city spread out below his windows. Everything he'd worked for, everything he'd built, was balanced on the edge of a knife. On one side lay the business deal that would cement his place among Manhattan's most powerful men. On the other side lay a woman who had walked into his life through a cruel bet and somehow become. What? What was Emma to him, really? That evening, Alexander found Emma on the penthouse terrace, looking out over the city lights. She'd changed into a simple black dress that somehow made her look more elegant than any of the designer gowns he'd bought her. You're going to choose the merger, she said without turning around. Alexander joined her at the railing, maintaining careful distance between them. It's what makes sense from a business perspective. Of course it does. Emma's voice held no anger, only a tired resignation. Richard Hartwell made his case quite convincingly, I'm sure. He thinks you're using me to get revenge on his family. Emma turned to face him then, and Alexander was shocked to see tears in her eyes, the first real emotional vulnerability she'd shown since moving into his home. And what do you think, Alexander? He wanted to tell her that he thought Hartwell was a paranoid old man clinging to outdated prejudices. He wanted to say that the past 3 weeks had shown him a woman of intelligence, dignity, and unexpected humor. He wanted to admit that somewhere between her piano performance and her quiet strength, he'd begun to fall in love with her. Instead, he heard himself say, "I think I can't afford to find out, or to..." Emma nodded slowly, as if she'd expected exactly that answer. "I'll be out of your penthouse by tomorrow evening. You can announce that our engagement was a mistake, that you've come to your senses. Your precious merger will be safe." She started to walk past him toward the door, but Alexander caught her arm. "Emma, wait. I need to ask you directly. Is Hartwell right? Are you here for revenge?" Emma looked down at his hand on her arm, then back to his face. "Alexander, if I told you the truth about why I'm really here, would you believe me? Or would you assume I was lying to protect my position?" The question hung between them, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. Alexander released her arm, and Emma disappeared into the penthouse, leaving him alone with the city lights and the growing certainty that he was about to make a choice that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Later that night, as Alexander lay awake staring at the ceiling, he heard the sound of piano music drifting through the penthouse. Emma was playing something he didn't recognize, a mournful, beautiful piece that seemed to capture all the sadness of dreams dying and chances lost forever. By morning, the music had stopped, and Alexander Sterling began preparing to choose his empire over his heart. Alexander's sleep was shattered at 3 a.m. by the insistent buzzing of his phone. Margaret's name appeared on the screen, and his assistant never called at this hour unless the world was ending. "Sir," Margaret's voice was tight with urgency, "you need to see the morning news, all channels, now." Alexander stumbled to his living room and turned on the television, flipping through channels until he found the breaking news report. What he saw made his blood turn to ice. Shocking revelation about the Blackwood Industries scandal that rocked Manhattan 8 years ago, the CNN anchor was saying. New evidence has surfaced, proving that Jonathan Blackwood was indeed framed by his business partner, David Hartwell, in an elaborate scheme to hide massive embezzlement and securities fraud. Alexander's legs gave out, and he collapsed onto his sofa as the report continued. The evidence was discovered in a safety deposit box registered to David Hartwell, accessed only after his death 2 years ago by Swiss authorities investigating international money laundering. The box contained signed confessions, forged documents, and recorded conversations proving that Hartwell orchestrated the entire scheme to frame his partner when federal investigators got too close to their offshore accounts. The screen filled with documents, David Hartwell's handwriting confessing to years of embezzlement, detailed plans for framing Jonathan Blackwood, and most damning of all, recordings of Hartwell laughing about destroying that naive fool Jonathan while transferring millions to hidden accounts. Alexander's phone rang. Richard Hartwell's name appeared on the screen, but Alexander let it go to voicemail. He was too stunned to speak, too horrified by the implications of what he was seeing. The news anchor continued. Perhaps most heartbreaking is this final recording, made just days before David Hartwell's suicide, where he expresses remorse for destroying an innocent family. David Hartwell's voice, thick with guilt and alcohol, filled Alexander's living room. "Jonathan Blackwood was the most honest man I ever knew. He trusted me like a brother, and I destroyed him to save my own skin. His daughter, Emma. God, she was just a kid with dreams of being a concert pianist. What did I do to them? What did I do?" Alexander's phone buzzed with a text message from Margaret. "Sir, Richard Hartwell just issued a statement withdrawing from the merger indefinitely. He's claiming he needs time to process his family's tragic scandal. The financial press is calling it the collapse of the decade." But Alexander barely registered the business implications. All he could think about was Emma's face when he'd chosen the merger over believing in her. Emma, who had been telling the truth all along. Emma, whose family had been destroyed by the very people Alexander had chosen to trust over her. He found her in the guest suite, packing the same 2 modest suitcases she'd arrived with 3 weeks earlier. She looked up when he appeared in the doorway, and her expression was calm. Too calm, the kind of composure that came from years of practice at surviving devastating disappointment. "I suppose you've seen the news," she said quietly, folding a silk blouse with careful precision. "Emma, Alexander stopped, realizing that no words could adequately express his shame and regret. "I'm sorry, I'm so incredibly sorry." "Are you?" Emma continued packing, not looking at him. Or are you just sorry that your business deal fell through anyway? The question hit him like a physical blow because part of him wasn't sure of the answer. I should have believed you. I should have trusted you over Hartwell. Yes, you should have. Emma closed one suitcase and started on the second. But you didn't, and that tells me everything I need to know about what I mean to you versus what your business empire means to you. Alexander stepped into the room, desperate to make her understand. Emma, please, give me another chance. Let me prove that I can choose you over everything else. Emma's laugh was bitter. Alexander, you had your chance to choose me. You had your chance to believe in me, to trust me, to see me as more than just a potential threat to your precious deals. And you failed. People make mistakes, Emma. People learn from their mistakes. Some mistakes can't be undone. Emma straightened, meeting his eyes directly. Do you know what the worst part of this is? It's not that you chose business over me. I expected that from a man like you. The worst part is that for 3 weeks I actually believed you were different. I thought maybe, just maybe, you were falling in love with me the way I was falling in love with you. The admission hung in the air between them, more devastating than any accusation. Alexander felt something crack inside his chest at the realization that he'd had something precious and rare, and he'd thrown it away for a business deal that had crumbled anyway. You were falling in love with me? He asked quietly. Emma's composure finally broke, tears spilling down her cheeks. God help me, yes. Despite everything, your arrogance, your cruelty at that restaurant, your assumption that I was beneath you, I was falling in love with the man I saw in quiet moments. The man who asked thoughtful questions about my music, who listened when I talked about my dreams, who made me feel like maybe I could trust someone again. Alexander moved closer, his own eyes burning with unshed tears. Emma, I was falling in love with you too. I am in love with you. That's why this is so hard. That's why I'm terrified of losing you. But not terrified enough to choose me when it mattered. The simple truth of it was unbearable. Alexander had spent his entire adult life making calculated decisions, weighing risks and benefits, never letting emotions cloud his judgment. But with Emma, he'd let fear override his heart when his heart was finally telling him something important. What can I do? He asked desperately. How can I fix this? Emma wiped her tears and picked up her suitcases. You can let me go, Alexander. You can let me walk out of here with whatever dignity I have left, and you can go back to your empire building and your mergers and your safe, calculated life. I don't want that life without you in it. Then you should have thought of that yesterday when you chose Richard Hartwell's word over mine. Emma walked toward the door, but Alexander blocked her path. Please, just tell me what you want. Tell me how to make this right. Emma looked at him for a long moment, and Alexander saw 8 years of pain and disappointment in her green eyes. I want you to mean it when you say you love me. I want you to choose me not because it's convenient or because your business deal fell through anyway, but because you genuinely believe I'm worth more than any deal, any merger, any amount of money. You are worth more than any of that. Prove it. How? Emma smiled sadly. That's something you'll have to figure out yourself, Alexander. Grand gestures are easy when you have unlimited money. But real love, real trust, real commitment, those require something you've never been willing to give anyone. What's that? Faith. Faith in another person without guarantees, without safety nets, without assurance of profit or return on investment. Emma stepped around him toward the door. When you're ready to love someone with that kind of faith, call me. Until then, goodbye. She was gone before he could respond, leaving only the faint scent of her perfume and the echo of devastating truth in her words. Alexander stood in the empty guest suite, surrounded by the wreckage of the best thing that had ever happened to him, and realized that for all his business acumen, he'd never learned the most important lesson of all. Some gambles were worth taking, not because you were guaranteed to win, but because losing them would cost you everything that really mattered. For the first time in his adult life, Alexander Sterling understood what it meant to feel truly poor. Outside his windows, Manhattan sparkled in the early morning light, but Alexander barely noticed. He was too busy figuring out how to prove to the woman he loved that she was worth more than his entire empire, and wondering if he was brave enough to actually do it. 2 months after Emma left, Alexander Sterling had systematically dismantled every assumption about himself that he'd built over 34 years. The revelation of David Hartwell's guilt had done more than vindicate Emma's family. It had forced Alexander to confront the uncomfortable truth that he'd inherited his father's prejudices along with his business empire. He'd spent weeks in therapy, learning to recognize the difference between calculating risks and refusing to be vulnerable. He'd restructured Sterling Industries to prioritize ethical practices over maximum profit. And most importantly, he'd begun the painstaking process of locating every person who had suffered when the Blackwood family fell, quietly making financial amends without fanfare or credit. But none of that mattered if he couldn't find Emma. She'd vanished from New York as completely as if she'd never existed. Her Queens apartment had been vacated, her former co-workers at the restaurant had no forwarding address, and even his most skilled private investigators had come up empty. Emma Blackwood had learned how to disappear from 8 years of survival in the shadows of society. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Margaret Chen knocked on his office door on a rainy Thursday evening with an expression that suggested good news for the first time in months. "Sir, I found her." Alexander's heart stopped. "Where?" "Boston. She's been working as a piano instructor at the New England Conservatory, using her maiden name and teaching under a program for underprivileged children." Margaret handed him a file. "She's also been living in a small apartment near the school and apparently playing weekend gigs at a jazz club in Cambridge." Alexander stared at the address, his hands trembling slightly. "How long has she been there?" "Since about a week after she left New York. Sir, there's something else. I made some discreet inquiries, and it appears she's been donating most of her salary to a scholarship fund for children whose families have faced financial disasters. She's calling it the Jonathan Blackwood Memorial Fund." The information hit Alexander like a physical blow. While he'd been wallowing in self-pity and business restructuring, Emma had been quietly building something beautiful from the ashes of her own tragedy. "Margaret, I need you to charter a flight to Boston tonight." "Sir, it's nearly 10 p.m. "Tonight, Margaret, and call the conservatory's dean. I want to make a donation. A large one." The New England Conservatory was a beautifully preserved building that spoke of musical traditions stretching back generations. Alexander arrived at noon the next day, his heart hammering as he followed the sound of piano music through elegantly appointed hallways. He found Emma in a small practice room, working with a boy who couldn't have been more than 10 years old. Through the glass door, Alexander watched her demonstrate a passage with the same fluid grace he remembered, her face animated with the joy of teaching. She was wearing a simple navy dress and had cut her hair shorter, just to her shoulders, but she was every bit as beautiful as his memory had insisted during the long nights without her. More beautiful, actually, because she looked genuinely happy for the first time since he'd known her. When the lesson ended and the young student left, Alexander knocked softly on the door. Emma looked up, and the blood drained from her face when she saw him. "Hello, Emma." "Alexander." She stood slowly, her hands smoothing her dress in a nervous gesture he remembered. "What are you doing here?" "Learning to take the kind of gamble that has nothing to do with business profit." Emma's eyes were guarded, but he caught a flicker of something that might have been hope. "What does that mean?" Alexander stepped into the practice room, close enough to smell her familiar perfume, but careful not to invade her space. "It means I've spent the last 2 months figuring out the difference between wanting something and deserving it. It means I've been in therapy, learning why I was so terrified of trusting you that I chose to trust Richard Hartwell instead." "And what did you learn?" "That I spent my whole life building walls to protect myself from exactly what you were offering me. Real intimacy, real trust, real love without conditions or contracts." Alexander took a shaky breath. "I learned that I was a coward who was more afraid of being vulnerable than I was committed to being worthy of you." Emma was quiet for a long moment, studying his face. "Those are important lessons, Alexander. I'm glad you learned them. But learning them doesn't automatically make everything okay between us." Alexander nodded. "I know. That's why I'm here to prove that I've changed, not just promise that I have." "How do you plan to do that?" Alexander reached into his jacket and pulled out a legal document. "By doing something that goes against every business instinct I've ever had." Emma took the document, her eyes widening as she read. "This is This is a transfer of 50% of Sterling Industries to the Jonathan Blackwood Memorial Foundation, with you as the sole trustee, empowered to direct how those profits are used. No oversight from me, no conditions, no strings attached. Alexander's voice was steady despite his racing heart. Half my empire, given freely to you to use as you see fit. Emma stared at the document, then at him. Alexander, this is hundreds of millions of dollars. It's proof that I value you more than money. It's proof that I trust you completely, without guarantee of return on investment. It's proof that I choose you over everything else, even when, especially when, I have no idea whether you'll choose me back. Emma set the document on the piano bench with trembling hands. You can't just throw money at this problem, Alexander. I'm not throwing money at the problem. I'm giving you the power to fix problems for thousands of other people, the way I should have had the power to fix your family's problems 8 years ago if I'd been paying attention to anything besides profit margins. Emma's eyes filled with tears. And what do you want in return? Nothing, Alexander said simply. If you take that money and use it to help people and never speak to me again, I'll consider it the best investment I ever made. If you take it and give me a chance to prove I can love you the way you deserve to be loved, I'll consider myself the luckiest man alive. Emma turned to look out the practice room window at the students crossing the courtyard below. You know what the hardest part of loving you was? What? Knowing that you had the capacity to be everything I needed, but watching you choose to be less than that because it felt safer. She faced him again. You broke my heart, Alexander. Not because you chose your business over me, but because you chose fear over love. I know, and I'm sorry. Not just sorry that it happened, but sorry that I was the kind of man who let it happen. Emma wiped her eyes. The man I fell in love with, the one I saw in quiet moments, would never have made the choice you made that night. Then let me prove I can be that man consistently, not just in quiet moments. Alexander stepped closer. Emma, I love you. Not because you're beautiful, or talented, or intriguing, but because you make me want to be better than I am. You make me want to deserve the kind of love you're capable of giving. And how do I know you won't get scared again when things get difficult? Alexander smiled, and Emma was startled to see that it was different from his old smiles, warmer, more genuine, less calculated. Because I'm more scared of losing you than I am of being vulnerable with you. Because I've learned that the biggest risk isn't opening my heart, it's keeping it closed and missing out on the kind of love that makes everything else meaningless. Emma stared at him for a long moment, and Alexander held his breath, waiting for her verdict. The scholarship fund, she said quietly. What about it? I want to expand it. Not just for families facing financial disaster, but for any child who shows musical promise but can't afford training. I want to create a network of programs across the country. Alexander's heart began to race. That sounds like an incredible use of resources. It would take years to build. I'd need someone I could trust completely to help manage the business side while I focused on the educational programs. I can think of someone who might be qualified for that position. Emma's smile was small but genuine. Can you? Someone with business experience but also a commitment to putting people before profits. Someone who's learned that the most important skill in business is knowing when not to be businesslike. Emma laughed, and the sound was like music to Alexander's ears. And what would this person want in return for such a commitment? The chance to wake up every morning next to the woman he loves. The opportunity to build something meaningful together instead of just building an empire. Maybe a lifetime of piano concerts in the evenings and quiet conversations over dinner. Emma stepped closer, close enough that Alexander could see gold flecks in her green eyes. That sounds like a significant long-term investment. The best investments always are. And you're prepared to make that kind of commitment, without guarantees, without certainty of success. Alexander reached up to touch her face gently. Emma Blackwood, I'm prepared to love you with the kind of faith that doesn't require guarantees. I'm prepared to choose you every day, in every situation for the rest of my life. I'm prepared to be the man you saw in me before I was brave enough to see him in myself. Emma leaned into his touch, and Alexander felt his world shift back into focus for the first time in 2 months. Alexander Sterling, are you asking me to marry you? For real this time? I'm asking you to let me spend my life proving that some gambles are worth taking, not because you're guaranteed to win, but because losing them would cost you everything that matters. Emma's kiss was her answer, sweet and certain, and full of the promise of second chances and hard-won wisdom. When they broke apart, both of them were crying and laughing at the same time. So, Emma said, wiping his tears with her thumb, I suppose we have a foundation to run and a wedding to plan. I suppose we do, Alexander agreed, though I should warn you. I'm thinking of making this wedding significantly more elaborate than a restaurant bet. Emma's laugh was pure joy. Well, I should warn you that I'm thinking of inviting some of my piano students to perform at the reception. Perfect. I'll make sure to have several pianos available, just in case you decide to make any more foolish wagers. Alexander pulled her closer, marveling at how perfectly she fit in his arms. Emma, I've already made the only wager that matters. I'm betting my heart on us, and this time I'm confident we both win. Outside the practice room windows, Boston autumn afternoon light filtered through the conservatory's historic architecture. But Alexander and Emma only had eyes for each other and the future they would build together. One built on love, trust, and the kind of faith that turns the most impossible gambles into the most beautiful victories.
For Eleanor Vance, a woman whose name was synonymous with unimaginable wealth, every object had a price. From skyscrapers in Manhattan to private jets, her world was a catalogue of acquisitions. But in the hushed elegance of a Michelin-starred restaurant, her eyes fell upon a simple silver locket worn by a waitress struggling to make ends meet. In that instant, the billionaire's carefully constructed empires of steel and glass crumbled, replaced by a flood of tears and a memory she had buried for 50 years. What was it about this cheap piece of jewelry that could shatter the composure of one of the world's most powerful women? The answer would unravel a story of lost love, forced sacrifice, and a secret that money could never buy. Eleanor Vance moved through the world with a quiet, practiced authority. At 82, her posture was impeccable, her silver hair styled in a flawless chignon, and her eyes, the color of a stormy sea, missed nothing. Tonight she was dining at Aria, San Francisco's most exclusive restaurant, a place where the tasting menu cost more than the monthly rent for most of the city's inhabitants. It was a Tuesday, a day of no particular significance, which was precisely why she was there. Anniversaries and birthdays were too painful, filled with the ghosts of a life once lived. Tuesdays were blessedly empty. Her companion was her son, Julian Vance, the CEO of Vance Industries, the global tech empire her late husband Richard had built. Julian was sharp, ambitious, and wore a suit tailored with surgical precision. He spoke of quarterly earnings and market acquisitions, his words forming a familiar, monotonous drone that Eleanor had long ago learned to tune out. "Mother, are you listening?" Julian asked, a hint of impatience in his voice. "The board is pushing for the acquisition of Aerosphere. It's a $1 trillion play." Eleanor offered a faint smile, her gaze drifting around the opulent room. Crystal chandeliers dripped light onto tables draped in heavy linen. The clinking of cutlery was a delicate symphony. It was all so perfect, so controlled, so suffocatingly lonely. Richard had been gone for a decade, and with him all the color had drained from her world. Now her life was a gilded cage, beautiful from the outside but cold and empty within. A young waitress approached their table to refill their water glasses. She moved with a quiet efficiency that spoke of exhaustion. Her uniform was pristine, but showed the faintest signs of wear at the cuffs. Her hair, a simple brown ponytail, was slightly askew as if she'd been rushing. She was unremarkable in every way, just another face in the endless parade of service staff that populated Eleanor's life. "Will there be anything else, Mr. Vance? Mrs. Vance?" the waitress asked, her voice soft but clear. Julian dismissed her with a wave of his hand, already engrossed in his phone. But Eleanor's eyes were not on the waitress's face. They were fixed on her neck. Peeking from the collar of her uniform was a silver chain. It was thin and delicate, the kind of thing a young girl might wear. But it was the pendant that made Eleanor's breath catch in her throat. It was a starburst locket, its silver slightly tarnished with age. At its very center, where the rays of the star converged, was a tiny, deep blue sapphire, no bigger than a pinhead. Time stopped. The murmur of the restaurant faded into a dull roar in Eleanor's ears. Her heart began to pound against her ribs, a frantic, painful rhythm. It couldn't be. After all these years, it simply couldn't be. There were millions of lockets in the world, but not like this one. This one was unique. She knew every groove, every imperfection in the hand-engraved rays. She knew the feel of its cool metal against her skin. She had designed it herself. "Mother, what is it? You look pale," Julian said, finally looking up from his screen. Eleanor didn't hear him. Her vision tunneled, focusing solely on the locket. A torrent of memories locked away for half a century broke free. A summer of stolen glances, the scent of oil paints and turpentine, the weight of a forbidden love, and the gut-wrenching pain of a choice she was forced to make. The waitress, sensing the older woman's intense stare, shifted uncomfortably. She tucked the locket further into her collar, a subconscious protective gesture. But it was too late. Eleanor had seen it. A sound escaped her lips, a choked, agonizing sob that was utterly alien in the refined atmosphere of Aria. Her manicured hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and profound, soul-deep grief. Tears, hot and unstoppable, streamed down her perfectly powdered cheeks, carving paths through the mask of composure she had worn for decades. "That locket," she whispered, her voice trembling, her finger pointing with a shaky hand. Where did you get that locket?" The entire restaurant seemed to fall silent. Julian stared, dumbfounded, at his mother's unprecedented emotional breakdown. The young waitress, whose name tag read Mia, looked from the weeping billionaire to the locket at her neck, her face a canvas of confusion and alarm. Eleanor Vance, the matriarch of a financial dynasty, a woman who had faced down hostile takeovers and buried a husband without shedding a public tear, was crying. Not with quiet dignity, but with the raw, heart-shattering anguish of a long-lost hope that had just impossibly reappeared. The scene at table 7 sent a ripple of consternation through Aria. The maitre d', a man named Jean-Pierre, who prided himself on orchestrating flawless evenings, hurried over his face a mask of professional concern. "Is everything all right, Mrs. Vance?" he inquired, his voice a low, soothing murmur. Julian, recovering from his shock, quickly took control. "My mother is just feeling a bit unwell. A momentary episode. We'll be fine." He shot a sharp, dismissive glare at the waitress Mia. "You can go." But Eleanor's hand shot out her grip, surprisingly strong as she latched onto Mia's arm. "No, don't go. Please," she pleaded, her voice thick with tears. "That locket! I must know about it." Mia stood frozen, a deer in the headlights. The attention of the entire room was on her. She was acutely aware of her worn shoes, the pen stain on her apron, and the immense, unbridgeable gulf between her world and that of the woman holding her arm. It was my mother's," Mia stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "She gave it to me." "Your mother?" Eleanor's eyes searched Mia's face, looking for a resemblance, a clue, anything. "What is her name?" Where is she?" Julian intervened, his tone firm. "Mother, this is hardly the time or place. You're causing a scene." He pried his mother's fingers from Mia's arm and turned to the young woman. "My apologies. My mother is tired. She mistook your necklace for something else." He pulled out a thick black card holder. "For your trouble." He tried to press several $100 bills into her hand. Mia flinched back as if the money were hot. "No, thank you, sir. It's all right." Her eyes darted back to Eleanor, who was now weeping silently, her shoulders shaking. There was a raw, genuine pain in the older woman's eyes that transcended their different stations in life. It was the pain of a human heart breaking. "Please," Eleanor said again, her voice regaining a sliver of its customary command, though it was frayed with emotion. "I will pay you for it. Name your price. $10,000. 20,000. Mia's eyes widened. $20,000 was more than she made in a year. It was enough to cover her own mother's mounting medical bills, to fix the leaky roof in their tiny apartment, to breathe for the first time in years. A wave of temptation washed over her, so powerful it made her dizzy. She could solve so many problems with that money. She instinctively clutched the locket. It was cool against her warm skin, a familiar weight she had known her entire life. It was the only thing she had from her mother that felt truly hers. Her mother Sarah was sick, her memory fading in and out like a faulty radio signal. But when she was lucid, she would sometimes touch the locket and smile. "That's your story," she would whisper, her voice frail. "It's all in there. It'll keep you safe." Mia didn't know what story it held. Her mother's past was a collection of fragmented, half-remembered tales. She didn't know who her father was, or where her mother had come from before arriving in San Francisco with a baby and a single suitcase. The locket was her only tangible link to that mystery, to her own identity. To sell it would be like selling a piece of her soul. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Vance," Mia said, her voice finding a surprising strength. "I can't sell it. It's not for sale." Julian scoffed in disbelief. "Don't be ridiculous. It's a piece of silver. I'll write you a check for $50,000, right now. You can quit this job tonight." The offer hung in the air, glittering and seductive. $50,000. It was a fortune. But as Mia looked at Eleanor, she saw not a billionaire trying to buy a trinket, but a woman desperate to reclaim a piece of her past. And Mia, who had so little of her own past to hold on to, understood that sentiment perfectly. "No," she said more firmly this time. "My answer is no. I'm very sorry for your distress." She gave a slight formal bow. "If you'll excuse me, I need to get back to my work." With that, she turned and walked away, her heart hammering in her chest. She could feel the stares of every patron, hear the whispers. She fled to the relative safety of the kitchen, her hands shaking so badly she had to grip the edge of a stainless steel counter to steady herself. Back at the table, Julian was furious. The audacity! A $50,000 offer for some cheap bauble, and she refuses. "She's playing you, Mother. She'll come back tomorrow with a lawyer demanding $1 million. But Eleanor wasn't listening. Her gaze was fixed on the kitchen door, through which Mia had disappeared. The girl's refusal hadn't angered her. It had intrigued her. It confirmed the locket's value was not monetary. The girl cherished it, just as she was supposed to. "Get me her name, Julian," Eleanor said, her voice low and resolute. The tears had stopped, replaced by a steely determination. Her full name, her address, everything you can find out about her. "What are you going to do?" Julian asked, bewildered. Eleanor dabbed her eyes with a linen napkin, her composure slowly returning like armor being reassembled piece by piece. "If she won't sell a memory," she said, her voice dangerously quiet, "then I shall have to buy her story." The next morning, the sterile quiet of Eleanor Vance's penthouse apartment was disrupted by the arrival of a man named David Harrison. Harrison was a private investigator, a man whose nondescript appearance belied a formidable talent for unearthing secrets. He was discreet, efficient, and expensive, the best in the business. Eleanor, dressed in a silk morning robe, sat opposite him in her vast, sun-drenched living room, which offered a panoramic view of the Golden Gate Bridge. The emotional storm of the previous night had passed, leaving behind an unsettling calm and a singular, obsessive focus. "I want to know everything about her," Eleanor stated, her voice devoid of its earlier fragility. "Amelia Russo. She works at Aria. Find out where she lives, who her family is, what her circumstances are. Be thorough, but be invisible. I don't want her to know she's being watched." "Understood, Mrs. Vance," Harrison said, making a few notes in a small leather-bound book. Julian, who had been listening from the doorway, stepped into the room. "This is absurd, Mother. You're paying a man thousands of dollars to investigate a waitress. If you want the necklace, our legal team can draft an offer she can't refuse, or we can find its provenance, claim it as a stolen family artifact." "It wasn't stolen." Eleanor snapped her gaze sharp. "And this is not about the locket anymore. It is about the girl. There was something in her eyes, Julian, a resilience, and she refused your money. That is not the behavior of a common opportunist. It's the behavior of a clever opportunist," Julian countered. "She knows she has you on the hook. She's waiting for a bigger offer." Eleanor fell silent, her gaze drifting towards a small, dust-free bookshelf in the corner of the room. It was out of place amongst the modern art and designer furniture. It held old leather-bound volumes of poetry and several worn books on art history. Julian never paid them any mind, but for Eleanor, that corner was a shrine. While Harrison gathered his instructions and departed, Eleanor walked over to the bookshelf. Her fingers traced the spine of a book titled The Renaissance of Light. She pulled it from the shelf. Tucked inside was a faded black-and-white photograph, its edges soft with time. It showed a much younger Eleanor, her hair long and unbound, her smile radiant and unburdened. Her arm was linked with that of a young man with intense dark eyes and a paint-smudged shirt. He was handsome, with a wild energy that seemed to leap from the photograph. His name was Thomas Reed. The locket hadn't been a gift from her late husband, Richard. Richard had given her diamonds, emeralds, entire real estate portfolios. He had given her a life of unimaginable luxury and security. But he had never given her the locket. The locket was from Thomas. He had been a painter, a brilliant, penniless artist, living in a tiny studio in North Beach. Eleanor, then a young heiress, from a suffocatingly strict and old money family, had met him during a rebellious visit to a local art gallery. Their love affair was a whirlwind, secret, passionate, and doomed from the start. Her parents would never have approved of a match so far beneath her station. Thomas had crafted the locket himself, melting down his grandfather's silver cufflinks. He had hammered and shaped the metal engraving, the starburst pattern, with his own tools. The tiny sapphire he'd told her he'd traded a painting for. "It's the color of your eyes when you look at my art," he'd said, his voice full of a sincerity that Richard, for all his power, could never muster. Their love had a consequence. A baby. A daughter. The memory still had the power to steal her breath. Her parents had been furious, their disappointment a cold, crushing weight. They had orchestrated everything. She was sent away to a private clinic in a remote part of the state. Thomas was threatened, paid off, and told to disappear from her life forever. He had tried to fight it, but he was no match for the power and influence of her family. Eleanor was allowed to hold her baby only once, a beautiful, perfect little girl. Before the agency took her, Eleanor had pressed the starburst locket into the infant's swaddling clothes, a desperate, silent promise that she would one day find her. She named her Lily, but her parents had covered their tracks too well. The adoption was sealed anonymous. By the time Eleanor was free from her family's control, married to the kind and powerful Richard Vance, who offered her a respectable escape, all trails to her daughter had gone cold. She had hired investigators over the years, but they had found nothing. Eventually, the pain became a dull, constant ache, a ghost she learned to live with, until last night. Seeing that locket had ripped open the 50-year-old wound. Could it be a coincidence? A replica? No. She knew in her bones it was the one, which meant that the waitress Amelia Russo was somehow connected to her lost Lily. The intercom buzzed, pulling her from her reverie. "Mrs. Vance, Mr. Harrison is on the line. He says he has some preliminary information of interest." Eleanor's hand trembled as she picked up the phone. "Yes, Mrs. Vance." Harrison's voice was professional and clipped. "Amelia Russo lives at 14B Orchard Street in the Mission District. She's the sole caregiver for her mother, Sarah Russo. I'm looking into Sarah now. But the interesting part is the finances. They're in significant medical debt, Miss. Russo works 2 jobs, the dinner shift at Aria and a morning shift at a diner called The Daily Grind. Her mother's condition, it appears to be degenerative, neurological. The bills are overwhelming." Eleanor sank into a chair. The girl wasn't a clever opportunist holding out for more money. She was desperate. She had refused $50,000, a sum that could have eased her burden immensely out of pure sentiment. "Thank you, Mr. Harrison," Eleanor said, her voice strained. "Keep digging. I want to know everything about Sarah Russo." She hung up the phone, her mind racing. Sarah. The name meant nothing to her. But the girl's poverty, her quiet dignity, her fierce protection of the one link to her past. It was all starting to form a picture, one that was both terrifying and filled with an impossible flickering hope. Julian Vance did not share his mother's sentimental intrigue. He saw the situation in stark binary terms, a problem and a solution. The problem was a waitress who had stumbled upon a piece of leverage and was causing his mother emotional distress. The solution was to apply overwhelming force. Bypassing his mother, who he felt was becoming irrationally obsessed, Julian had his own team run a background check on Amelia Russo. The results were the same as Harrison's, but Julian interpreted them differently. He saw not a struggling daughter, but a collection of vulnerabilities. Debt, a sick parent, a precarious financial existence. These were levers to be pulled. 2 days after the incident at Aria Mia was finishing her shift at the Daily Grind, her second job. It was a greasy spoon diner, a world away from the refined elegance of Aria. Her feet ached, and the smell of bacon grease clung to her clothes. All she wanted was to go home, check on her mother, and fall into bed. As she stepped out into the drizzly afternoon, a sleek black car pulled up to the curb, its tinted windows humming down. A man in a suit, not Julian, but clearly one of his lieutenants, got out. "Miss Russo," he said, his tone polite but firm. "Mr. Julian Vance would like a word with you." Mia's heart sank. She had been dreading this. "I'm sorry, I'm really tired. I have to get home." "It will only take a moment," the man insisted, gesturing to the open car door. It was not a request. Reluctantly, Mia slid into the plush leather interior. Julian Vance sat opposite her, his laptop open, his face illuminated by the screen's glow. He didn't look up for a full minute, a deliberate power play that made Mia feel small and insignificant. "Miss Russo," he finally said, closing the laptop. "I'll be direct. My mother has developed a fixation on your necklace. It is unhealthy. I want to put an end to it." "I already told your mother it's not for sale," Mia said, clutching her bag. "Everything is for sale," Julian countered smoothly. "You're simply negotiating. It's a bold strategy, I'll admit, refusing the initial offer to drive up the price. But the game is over." He slid a thick envelope across the seat. "Inside is a check for $75,000 and a non-disclosure agreement. You sign the paper, you give us the locket, and you never contact my mother or any member of my family again. You also, of course, resign from your position at Aria." Mia stared at the envelope. $75,000. The number was even more staggering than the last, but the way he presented it felt like an insult, a transaction stripping all emotion from the equation. "It's not about the money," she insisted, her voice shaking slightly. "It has sentimental value." Julian let out a short, humorless laugh. "Sentimental value doesn't pay for oncology specialists at UCSF Medical Center, does it? Or for the experimental drug trials for early-onset Alzheimer's? We know about your mother, Sarah. We know about the debt collectors. We know that the social worker, Mrs. Albright, is considering moving your mother into a state-run facility because you can no longer provide adequate care." Mia felt the blood drain from her face. They had dug into her life, into the most painful private corners of her existence. They had taken her struggle and turned it into a weapon to use against her. It felt violating, cruel. "How dare you?" she whispered, a mixture of fear and fury rising in her. "This is not a threat, Miss Russo. It's an observation of fact." Julian said, his voice cold as ice. "I am offering you a lifeline. That money can secure the best care for your mother. It can give you a life free from the constant anxiety of debt. All for a piece of metal. It's a logical, practical choice." He was twisting the knife, framing her love for her mother against her attachment to the locket. He was making her feel selfish for holding on to the one thing that gave her a sense of history. Tears welled in her eyes, but she fought them back. She would not cry in front of this man. She thought of her mother, of the fear in her eyes during her bad days, and the brief, beautiful moments of clarity. This locket was part of that part of her. "The answer is still no," Mia said, her voice trembling, but resolute. "What you are doing is monstrous. Please just leave me alone." Julian's expression hardened. The veneer of corporate civility vanished, replaced by undisguised contempt. "Fine. Have it your way. But understand this. My family has resources. We can make things difficult. Landlords can be persuaded to terminate leases. Employers can be convinced that a certain employee is a source of disruption. You are a fly buzzing around an elephant, Miss Russo. I strongly suggest you stop before you get swatted." The threat hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. The driver opened her door. Mia scrambled out of the car, her legs unsteady. The black sedan sped away, leaving her standing on the wet pavement, shaken and terrified. She ran all the way home, bursting into her small, cramped apartment. Her mother, Sarah, was sitting by the window looking out at the rain. Today was one of her better days. "Mia, honey, you're soaked," Sarah said, her voice gentle. "What's wrong?" You look like you've seen a ghost." Mia collapsed onto the sofa, finally letting the tears come. She told her mother everything: the billionaire at the restaurant, the emotional breakdown, the aggressive son, the offers of money, the threats. Sarah listened patiently, her expression growing sad. She reached out and took Mia's hand, her fingers frail and cool. Her eyes went to the locket around Mia's tall mane neck. "They want it that badly," Sarah murmured, more to herself than to Mia. "I don't understand why," Mia sobbed. "Why is it so important to them?" Sarah's gaze became distant, her mind drifting through the fog of her illness. "He made it for the girl with eyes like the sea," she whispered. The words disconnected a fragment of a memory, a star to guide her home, before they sent her away. Mia frowned, confused. What mum? Who sent who away? But the moment of clarity was gone. Sarah's eyes glazed over. She smiled vaguely and began to hum a tune that had no melody. Mia's heart ached. The cryptic words were just another piece of the puzzle of her mother's past, a puzzle that was becoming more complex and dangerous by the day. She held the locket tightly. It was no longer just a keepsake. It was the center of a storm, and she was trapped within it. Julian's aggressive tactics had the opposite of their intended effect. When Eleanor learned from a distraught Jean-Pierre that Mia had been dismissed from her job at Aria, at Julian's insistence, she was incandescent with fury. She summoned Julia to her penthouse. For the first time in years, he saw not a frail, aging mother, but the formidable woman who had stood beside his father as he built an empire. "How dare you?" she demanded, her voice dangerously low. "How dare you use the power and wealth of this family to bully a young woman who has done nothing but work for an honest living? You threatened her. You had her fired." "I was protecting you," Julian retorted, standing his ground. "You were becoming obsessed, emotional. She's a nobody, a grifter looking for a payday. I solved the problem." "You are the problem, Julian," Eleanor said, her disappointment a palpable force in the room. "You see the world as a series of transactions. You see people as assets or liabilities. You have your father's business sense, but you have none of his heart. Leave. I will handle this myself. From now on, you will stay away from Amelia Russo." After Julian departed, his face a thunderous mask of indignation, Eleanor felt a profound sense of isolation. Her own son was a stranger to her, a man molded by the very wealth she now found so meaningless. She called David Harrison. "I want to change the focus of the investigation," she said, her voice firm. "I don't care about Amelia Russo's finances anymore. I want to know about her mother, Sarah Russo. Find her birth certificate. I want to know where and when she was born. Dig into the adoption records for that area for that year. Cross-reference everything. Spare no expense." It was a long shot, a wild, desperate gamble based on nothing more than a gut feeling and a 50-year-old piece of jewelry. While Harrison's team began the painstaking work of sifting through decades of sealed and archived records, Eleanor retreated into her own past. She unlocked a safe hidden behind a painting in her study and removed a small leather-bound box. Inside were the few relics she had kept from her time with Thomas Reed. There were a handful of letters, written in his elegant looping script, filled with passionate declarations of love and dreams of a future together. There was a charcoal sketch he had done of her, capturing a light in her eyes that Richard had never seen. And at the bottom of the box was a small velvet pouch. Inside was a single earring, a silver starburst with a tiny sapphire at its center. It was the matching piece to the locket. Thomas had only had enough silver for 1.5 pairs. He'd given her the locket and one earring, keeping the other for himself as a promise. A promise to find her and their child. A promise he was never able to keep. She clutched the earring, the sharp points digging into her palm. The memories were so vivid, so painful. The sterile white room of the clinic. The condescending pity in the nurse's eyes. The crushing weight of her parents' decision presented as an inescapable reality. It's for the best, Eleanor. The child will have a good life with a proper family. You will forget. You will move on. But she had never forgotten. Not for a single day. The ghost of her daughter Lily had haunted the periphery of her life, a constant, silent presence. Days turned into a week. Eleanor barely ate her mind, consumed by the past and the desperate hope for the future. Then the call came. Mrs. Vance, David Harrison's voice, was different. The professional detachment was gone, replaced by something that sounded like awe. We found it. It took leveraging every contact I have and a court order from a very friendly judge, but we unsealed the records. Eleanor held her breath, her knuckles white as she gripped the phone. Sarah Russo was born on October the 12th, 1973, at St. Jude's Mercy Home for Unwed Mothers in Monterey County, Harrison said. She was placed for adoption a day later. Her birth mother is listed on the original sealed certificate. He paused. The name on the certificate is Eleanor Marguerite Chadwick. Chadwick. It was her maiden name. The world tilted on its axis. The air rushed from Eleanor's lungs. It was true. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't a delusion. It was real. Sarah Russo was her Lily. The waitress, the quiet, resilient young woman named Amelia, was her granddaughter. Mrs. Vance, are you still there? Harrison's voice was full of concern. Yes, Eleanor whispered, tears blurring the panoramic view from her window into a smear of blue and gold. Yes, I'm here. A lifetime of grief and longing crested within her, not as a wave of sorrow, but as a tidal wave of impossible earth-shattering joy. She had found her. After 50 years of searching, a waitress in a restaurant had unknowingly brought her daughter back to her. There's more, Harrison said gently. I looked into Sarah's adoptive parents. They were a kind, working-class couple. They passed away when Sarah was a teenager. She had a difficult life. And there's no record of Amelia's father. The birth certificate lists him as unknown. It explained so much. Why Sarah was alone, why they were struggling. Her daughter had lived a life of hardship, a world away from the gilded cage Eleanor inhabited. And now she was sick, her memory fading. A fierce protective instinct, the maternal love she had been forced to suppress for 50 years, roared to life. She would not lose her daughter again. Not when she had just found her. Book the best neurological specialist in the country, Mr. Harrison. Eleanor commanded, her voice ringing with an authority she hadn't felt in years. Dr. Alistair Finch at Johns Hopkins. Fly him to San Francisco on my private jet. Rent out an entire wing of the best hospital if you have to. And get me an address. I am going to see my granddaughter. For Mia, the world had become a landscape of fear. Julian Vance's threats echoed in her mind. Her manager at the Daily Grind had started treating her coldly, cutting her hours. She knew it was only a matter of time before she lost that job too. The letter from the landlord about a building-wide rent increase that seemed to apply only to her felt like another turn of the screw. She was being squeezed systematically and silently by a force she couldn't fight. Her mother's condition was worsening. The moments of lucidity were fewer and farther between. Mia spent her days terrified, feeling the walls closing in. The $75,000 she had refused now seemed like a foolish, prideful mistake. What was a piece of jewelry compared to her mother's well-being? One afternoon, as she was helping her mother with her lunch, Sarah's eyes suddenly cleared. She looked at Mia with a focus that had become heartbreakingly rare. "Mia," she said, her voice weak but clear. "The locket. Let me see it." Surprised, Mia took it off and placed it in her mother's palm. Sarah's frail fingers traced the starburst pattern, just as Eleanor's had in her memories. "My mother gave this to me," Sarah whispered. "Not the woman who raised me, my real mother. I never met her. They told me she was very young and her family was very powerful. They made her give me away." Mia leaned in her heart, pounding. Her mother had never spoken of this so clearly before. "What else, Mom? What did they tell you? Just that she loved me," Sarah said, a tear rolling down her cheek. "She left this for me. The nurse at the home, she made sure I got it. She said my mother called me Lily. She said the locket was a star to guide me." Her voice trailed off, the effort of remembering, exhausting her. "There's something inside. Did you ever look?" Mia's breath hitched. She had tried to open the locket 1,000 times as a child, but it was stuck, the clasp fused shut by age. She had always assumed it was empty. "It's jammed, Mom. It never opens." "There's a trick," Sarah murmured, her eyelids fluttering. "A little notch on the third ray. From the top." Mia's hands trembled as she took the locket. She examined it closely, her fingers searching. And there it was, a tiny, almost invisible indentation on one of the engraved rays. Using her fingernail, she pressed down hard on the spot. There was a faint click. The locket sprang open. Mia gasped. Tucked inside the two halves were two tiny, perfectly preserved secrets. On one side, protected by a sliver of glass, was a minuscule, faded photograph. It was a picture of a young woman with a radiant smile and eyes the color of the sea. The same woman from the restaurant, but decades younger. Eleanor Vance. On the other side, engraved in a delicate, swirling script, were 4 words. For Lily. Find me. Mia stared, her mind struggling to process the impossible truth. The woman from the restaurant. Her name was Eleanor. The name on her mother's original birth certificate was Eleanor. The nurse had said her mother called her Lily. For Lily. Find me. Her mother Sarah was Lily, and the billionaire Eleanor Vance was her grandmother. The realization crashed over her with the force of a physical blow. The obsession with the locket, the offers of money, the tears. It wasn't about an object. It was about a person. It was about her mother. Just as this earth-shattering truth was settling in, there was a soft knock on the apartment door. Mia's first instinct was fear. Was it Julian Vance's men coming to evict them? She opened the door cautiously. Standing in the drab hallway of her apartment building was Eleanor Vance. She was not the imperious matriarch from the restaurant. She was dressed simply in a cashmere sweater and slacks. Her face was pale, her eyes filled with a nervous, hopeful vulnerability. She was alone. "Amelia," Eleanor said, her voice soft. "May I please come in? I need to talk to you. And to your mother." Mia was speechless. She could only nod, stepping back to let the woman into her small, cluttered home. Eleanor's eyes scanned the room, taking in the worn furniture, the stack of medical bills on the counter, the sheer grinding reality of their poverty. Her gaze was filled with a profound, soul-crushing regret. Her eyes finally landed on Sarah, who was sitting in her chair by the window, now lost in her own world again. Eleanor took a hesitant step forward, then another. "Lily," she whispered the name, a breath of air, a prayer she hadn't dared to speak aloud for 50 years. Mia held up the open locket. "She told me," Mia said, her voice choked with emotion. "She just told me everything." Eleanor looked from the locket in Mia's hand to the face of her daughter, then back to the face of her granddaughter. The resemblance was undeniable, the same determined set of the jaw, the same strength in the eyes. Tears streamed down Eleanor's face once more, but this time they were not tears of grief. They were tears of homecoming. "I found you," Eleanor breathed, her voice breaking. "Oh, my darling girl, after all this time, I finally found you." She reached out, not for the locket, but for Mia's hand, her touch gentle and warm. The gulf between the billionaire and the waitress vanished, erased by a truth that had been hidden in a silver starburst for half a century. The air in the small apartment was thick with the weight of 50 years. It was a sacred space, a bubble of time where past and present had finally converged. Eleanor knelt by Sarah's chair. Her manicured fingers, which had signed billion-dollar contracts, now trembled as they gently stroked the hair of the daughter she had only ever held in her memory. She whispered the name Lily, a soft rhythmic chant, as if the sound itself could bridge the chasm of their lost decades. For a fleeting moment, Sarah's clouded eyes seemed to focus on her, and she leaned into the touch, a deep instinctual comfort overriding the fog of her illness. Mia stood a few feet away, the open locket still warm in her hand. The world had tilted its colors, shifting into new, unrecognizable hues. She was no longer just Mia Russo, the perpetually exhausted waitress swimming against a tide of debt. She was Amelia, the granddaughter of Eleanor Vance, the living link between a painful secret past and a future she couldn't begin to comprehend. The revelation was a dizzying mix of shock relief and a profound, bone-deep sorrow for the life her mother could have had. She looked at the two women, a tableau of reunion so raw and powerful it felt like a dream, and her own tears began to fall silently. This fragile, holy moment was shattered by a sound from the hallway. Heavy, purposeful footsteps, followed by a sharp, authoritative rap on the door that was less a knock and more a demand. Mia flinched, her fear of Julian Vance and his shadowy influence rushing back. Before she could move, the door was pushed open with enough force to make it bang against the wall. Julian Vance stood on the threshold, his face a mask of cold, controlled fury. He was flanked by two broad-shouldered men in dark, impeccably tailored suits, their presence instantly sucking the warmth from the room. They were not bodyguards. They were instruments of power, men who solved problems with quiet, unshakable efficiency. Julian's eyes swept across the scene, his gaze dripping with contempt. He noted his mother kneeling on the floor of this squalid apartment, the sick woman in the chair, and Mia, whom he saw as the architect of this whole charade. "I knew it," he spat the words slicing through the quiet room. He strode forward, his expensive leather shoes scuffing on the worn linoleum. "I knew you were a predator. It's a masterful performance, I'll give you that. You find a lonely old woman, discover some obscure detail of her past, and then you weave this elaborate, pathetic fantasy." He stopped directly in front of Mia, towering over her. How much did it take to convince her 100,000 too? What's the going rate for a fabricated family history these days? Mia shrank back, intimidated, but also ignited by a spark of defiance. You don't understand, she began, her voice barely a whisper. Oh, I understand perfectly. Julian interrupted, his voice dangerously low. I understand that my mother is vulnerable, and you are a parasite who has attached herself to this family's wealth. Well, the game is over. He turned to his mother. Mother, we are leaving. Now. These men will handle this transaction. They will retrieve your property and ensure Miss Russo understands the legal consequences of extortion. He nodded sharply at one of the men who took a step towards Mia, his hand outstretched for the locket. They will do no such thing. Julian. Eleanor's voice cut through the air like a shard of ice. She rose to her feet with a grace that defied her age, planting herself firmly between Julian's man and Mia. She was no longer the weeping, fragile woman from the restaurant or the remorseful mother on her knees. She was Eleanor Vance, the matriarch, and her eyes blazed with a protective fire Julian had not seen since his father's funeral. This is not a transaction, she declared, her voice ringing with absolute authority. And this, she said, gesturing to Mia, is not a parasite. This is my granddaughter, Amelia, and this woman, her voice broke with emotion as she pointed to Sarah, is my daughter, Lily. Julian let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. Daughter, granddaughter, mother. Listen to yourself. You are unwell. This pauper has poisoned your mind. You have never in my entire life mentioned a lost daughter. Because I was made to feel ashamed, Eleanor's voice boomed, startling them all with its power. Because my parents, your grandparents, decided that the family name was more important than a baby girl. They cared more for appearances and their social standing than for their own child's heart. I was 17. Julian. I was a scared girl in love with a man they deemed unsuitable, and they tore my life apart. They sent me away, they took my baby, and they threatened the man I loved until he disappeared forever. They told me to forget, to move on, to bury the shame. And for 50 years I have lived with that ghost. She took a step closer to her son, her gaze unwavering. You are just like them. You see a problem, and you throw money or threats at it. You cannot fathom that something's value could be anything other than monetary. You look at Amelia, and you see a poor waitress. I look at her, and I see a young woman with more integrity and love in her heart than you have ever shown. I offered her a fortune, Julian, a life-changing sum of money that could have solved every one of her problems. And she refused. She refused because this locket, my locket, the one I placed in my daughter's blanket, meant more to her than all the money in the world. Eleanor's gaze was relentless. You tried to destroy her. You had her fired. You threatened her housing, used the full weight of the Vance name to crush a girl who had nothing. And still she protected her mother's only keepsake. She protected my daughter's legacy without even knowing what it was. Silence descended, thick and heavy. Julian stared at his mother, the absolute conviction in her voice shaking the very foundations of his reality. Mia, emboldened by Eleanor's defense, held up her hand, the locket open in her palm. The light from the window caught the tiny faded photograph of the young, smiling Eleanor. Julian's eyes were drawn to it, to the undeniable proof. He saw the face of his mother before she was his mother, a girl full of a light he had never known. He saw the inscription, "For Lily. Find me." His carefully ordered world, a world of spreadsheets and market values, of clear wins and losses fractured. The cold logic that had been his armor for so long shattered against the irrefutable truth of this emotional, messy human story. He looked from the locket to Mia, and for the first time, he didn't see a pauper. He saw a young woman with his mother's eyes. He looked at the frail, sick woman in the chair and saw not a prop in a scam, but his aunt, a member of his family who had lived a life of hardship, while he had lived in unimaginable privilege. The magnitude of the family secret of the injustice hit him with the force of a physical blow. His entire identity was built on a lie of omission. The fury drained from his face, replaced by a ghastly pallor. The arrogance in his posture collapsed, leaving him looking suddenly younger and lost. He started, but no words came. What could he say? He had been monstrous. He had wielded his power with cruelty, all in the name of a truth that was utterly false. Shame, a foreign and corrosive emotion, burned in his gut. He couldn't bear to look at his mother's disappointed face or at the quiet dignity of the girl he had tried to break. Without another word, he turned on his heel and walked stiffly out of the apartment. He brushed past his trilliant, confused men, leaving them in the doorway. "Go," Eleanor commanded them, her voice quiet but firm. They glanced at each other, then retreated, closing the door softly behind them, sealing the new family within the quiet walls of the apartment. The storm had passed. In the ensuing silence, Mia finally let out a shuddering breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. Eleanor came to her, taking the locket and Mia's hand in her own. "He will come around," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Or he won't. It doesn't matter. What matters is us. Now." With a newfound purpose, Eleanor pulled out her phone. She made a call, her voice a calm, commanding force that Mia now understood could move mountains. "This is Eleanor Vance. I need Dr. Alistair Finch. I don't care what his schedule is. My private jet is on the tarmac at SFO. I want him in this city by morning, ready to see a patient. Yes, cost is no object. Make it happen." She hung up and turned to Mia, her eyes soft with a century of unshed tears. "Your mother will have the best care. You will have a home, a real home. You will never have to work 2 jobs again unless you choose to. You can go to school, travel anything. The world is yours now, Amelia." Mia could only shake her head, overwhelmed. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Eleanor said gently. She looked down at the locket, tracing the starburst with her finger. "Your grandfather made this," she whispered, giving Mia the final piece of her story. "His name was Thomas Reed. He was a brilliant painter, and he had the kindest soul I have ever known. He would have loved you so fiercely." Eleanor looked over at Sarah, who had drifted into a peaceful sleep. A real family. After a lifetime of loneliness in a palace of gold, Eleanor had finally found her home in a cramped 2-room apartment with a daughter lost to time and a granddaughter she never knew she had. The Vance fortune of stocks and steel was vast, but it was nothing compared to this. This was the real inheritance. This was the inheritance of the heart. In the end, it wasn't Eleanor Vance's billions that healed her broken heart. It was the discovery that the greatest treasure she ever possessed was not something she could buy, but someone she had lost. The story of Eleanor, Mia, and Lily reminds us that family is not defined by wealth or status, but by the unbreakable threads of love that weave through generations, sometimes getting lost, but never truly severed. Mia's simple locket, worthless in a pawn shop, turned out to be priceless, for it held the key to unlocking a 50-year-old secret and reuniting a family torn apart by circumstance. It's a powerful testament to the idea that our true legacy lies in the connections we forge and the love we refuse to forget. If this story of loss and reunion touched your heart, please let us know in the comments below. What would you have done in Mia's position? Don't forget to like this video and share it with someone who appreciates a story about the enduring power of family. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more real-life dramas that will move you, inspire you, and remind you of the extraordinary stories hidden within ordinary lives.